Now let's look at the standards that tell us how to do dimensioning. And what we are going to do is, in this video, I'd like to walk through the PowerPoint with you, and then in a separate video, we'll go over to AutoCAD and I'll show you how you do dimensioning in AutoCAD. These first two slides you've seen before when we talked about text and numbers. We looked at these, but I just put them in here for your convenience so you can see them again when you're thinking about dimensioning. And our text, as you recall, is a stylus style, all caps, 1/8 of an inch high. Let's look at the rules or the standards for dimensioning from the National CAD Standard. First of all, instead of arrowheads, what we use is a thing called an architectural tick. That's that diagonal line. You will see arrowheads some places, including the older version of the AIA Graphic Standards Manual, which was written before the National CAD Standard came into being. And sadly, you will see arrowheads in our textbook. I'm not sure why he's doing that. He might be left over from some old days. But anyway, the National CAD Standard says you are not allowed to use arrowheads. You must use architectural tick marks. And you get your choice of a thin tick or a thick tick. We are supposed to use the thick one. Now the text. The text is aligned with the dimension line, so if the dimension line is vertical, the text is vertical. If the dimension line is horizontal, the text is horizontal. And the text sits up above the dimension line, up above the dimension line. Here's another couple of examples. This one on the bottom is a metric floor plan, but still the same guideline. Aligned text and text up above the dimension line. Just for comparison, here are some dimensioning standards for architectural drawings and mechanical drawings side by side, just so you can see how different they are. Remember that in architectural drawings, the text is aligned, vertical with vertical lines, horizontal with horizontal lines. The text is above the dimension line, above the dimension line. The text uses foot and inch marks, and the dimension uses architectural ticks. By contrast, and quite different, mechanical drawings, which is the subject of another class, not this class, mechanical drawings always use the same direction for the text. It's always horizontal. It's always inside the dimension line. There are no foot or inch marks, and we use arrowheads. But here on the left, this is what our architectural drawings are supposed to look like. Now, where do we put dimensions? First of all, we keep our dimensions off the building insofar as possible. We put our dimensions outside the floor plan. And you will recall, I hope, that when it says a picture came from the National Institute of Building Sciences, that is the National CAD Standard. So here's a National CAD Standard example showing us how to keep dimensions off the building. Sometimes you have things inside a building where you just have to put dimensions in there. You just try to avoid it as much as possible. And the standard says, do not give a dimension, the same dimension, in more than one place. So give a single dimension only once. In other words, avoid over-dimensioning. And the reason for that, the primary reason, is let's say you ignored that standard and you put a dimension here and then you repeated it again someplace else just for good measure. Then let's say you came along later and you did a change order. You had to move this window. So you changed the number in this dimension You forgot that you also had that dimension elsewhere on your plan, and so you didn't change that number. Now your contractor comes along, and which number do they look at? What if they look at the wrong dimension and they don't see the other dimension? You have a potential for error. So we only dimension a thing in one place. Now in architectural drawings, it is standard to use what they call chain dimensioning, as you see here, a dimension from here to here to here to here to here to here, and also to give the overall dimension for all of that as well. Now in mechanical drawings, we cannot do that because of a thing called tolerance stack-up, but in architectural drawings, contractors handle architectural tolerances a little differently, and this is not only acceptable, it's preferred. You want to keep your dimension up away or out away from your building, have some space in there. And when you print your drawing or when you're looking at paper space, that space should be at least 3/8 of an inch away from the building. It can be farther, it just shouldn't be closer. There's not a standard for how far apart to put the remaining dimensions. It just says whatever spacing you choose, make them uniform. So don't make some of them close and some of them far apart. Make them all the same spacing. Start with the smallest dimensions closest to the building. Then next biggest, and the very biggest overall dimensions farthest from the building. That is going to prevent the problem where you have some dimensions crossing other dimensions. You will avoid crossing if you do it this way. Smallest dimensions close to the building. Biggest dimensions farthest away. We dimension outside to outside, so if you have a corner of your house or a bay window or a jog, anything like that, we dimension from the outside of the wall to the outside of the wall. And we dimension door openings and window openings to the center of the door, the center of the window, unless someone tells you otherwise. Now there are some framers and some contractors who would rather have you dimension to one side or the other of the opening, and if so, they will tell you, and if you're working with a contractor, you should ask them what they want. But unless otherwise specified, you put the dimensions to the center. You also dimension interior walls to the center of the wall unless someone says otherwise. Some offices prefer to go to one side or the other of the interior wall. Then, this is important for a professional looking drawing. Use O-snaps when you're snapping dimensions into place to make sure that all your dimensions in a string are exactly lined up with each other, not one a little bit up and one a little bit down, but exactly lined up using O-snaps. That's what really makes a sharp looking drawing. For interior dimensions, this is out of our book, and you'll notice he prefers to dimension to the face of a stud wall, one side or the other. The standard says to the center, but the face is perfectly fine too. And especially if you have a situation like, let's say you're doing a shower stall or a bathtub opening, you really need that inside of studs to be just a certain length. So that's a case where you really might want to dimension face to face. Some offices actually label that explicitly. FOS, which is face of stud. And remember, we are dimensioning this for our framers, so we're not going to tell them where all the finished sheetrock and wood paneling and all of that is going to be. We're telling them face of stud. By the way, we keep using the word partition. Down at the bottom of the slide it mentions a partition is another name for an interior wall, and usually they are not load-bearing walls. They're just walls that divide the spaces. If you are doing remodeling or renovation, there might be times when, due to the nature of your project, you need to give a dimension to the finished surface. Maybe you're doing some kind of fancy wood paneling and you really need to talk about what size that opening is. If that's the case, you abbreviate face of finish by writing FOF. You would not do that in new construction because that will be face of stud, but when you're doing a remodeling, you might need this. All right, on to the next.